All right. Good evening, everybody. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties in Indiana. If for those of you who don't know, that is right between Terre Haute and Bloomington. One of the things that I often am dealing with or working with are a lot of folks who are growing a lot of tomatoes. It is not unusual, especially in Clay County, to hear about people talk about their bumper crop of tomatoes. We definitely have our share of people doing heirloom varieties, along with your normal fare of different resistant varieties of beefsteak or other kinds. So, listening to tomatoes is something that I do quite a bit. Now, one of the biggest problems that I run into when it comes to people growing tomatoes is that we have a lot of disease that can hit our tomatoes. So, what I wanted to do this evening is just take a brief look at some of those diseases and what we can do to try to control for them. I will warn you, there is no silver bullet here. There's not going to be some magical thing you can do to prevent all disease or cure it when it gets on your tomatoes. The best thing we can do is prepare ahead of time. So why don't we go ahead and talk about our tomatoes just a little bit. So first, asking the question, I always love to include history and science when I do these. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about tomato history. In this case, where did tomatoes come from? So they are originally from the area of the Andes Mountain Range, which is modern day Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador. They were first cultivated by humans, so to speak, by the Aztecs and Incas circa 700 AD. So they are the past masters of developing different tomato varieties. And this is where we got that information from. Now, we didn't actually start growing tomatoes for a whole lot of time after that. There are a lot of myths that were surrounding tomatoes during that time period. And eventually, we did introduce them into modern cultivation in the 19th century. And this actually coincides fairly closely with the creation of sheet glass that was used to be able to create greenhouses and things like that. Now, a little more on where our tomatoes came from. So, tomatoes are a member of the nightshade family, which made a lot of people very, very concerned about if tomatoes are going to be dangerous to humans. And there are a few myths that you can actually look up from then, done by different researchers who were studying this, and they found that there was one myth that people believed that biting into a tomato could turn your blood to acid. And one myth goes that one person in the 1830s actually did this to prove that tomatoes are harmless. And of course, nothing happened to them. Now, there are a few different plants that we grow that are a part of the nightshade family. This includes potatoes, eggplants, peppers, tomatillos, and several other closely related plants to any of them on this list. Essentially, if it's got capsaicin in it, it's probably related to nightshade. And if it's a part of Solanaceae, pardon my pronunciation, I believe it's part of that group. So when it comes to our tomatoes, a lot of you already know this, but there are two primary growth patterns that will kind of determine how those tomatoes are going to grow and when they're going to produce their crop. These two patterns are determinate and indeterminate. So indeterminate is probably the one that we are most familiar with. These are tomatoes that are going to be primarily vining. Their growth points will be active the entire growing season. And during that season, they're going to produce lots of flowers and they're going to have multiple instances of fruit production. So indeterminate plants give you a great option to provide you tomatoes throughout the entire growing season. Versus determinate tomatoes, which is going to be our tomatoes, and instead of vining, they're going to be bushy. They're going to go and grow into a nice kind of shrub shape. Now, their growing points will stop at flowers. Every growing point will end in a bud. And this means that all of the tomatoes the plant will develop are going to come out at the same time. Now, this is really handy if you like canning your tomatoes, because what happens here, you get all your tomatoes at once, and you can do all of your canning at once, one time in the year. Now, these two plants, they're going to be different varieties that go in either of these. And if you order seeds or transplants, those labels should be able to tell you if you're getting indeterminate or determinate tomatoes. Most of the ones that I see personally are mostly indeterminate vining type tomatoes, but there will be some that you could find that are obviously going to be the bushier determinate. Now, one argument that I get exposed to quite a bit is people ask me, what is the value of heirloom versus hybrid tomatoes? Namely, people are going to say heirloom varieties have lasted longer, so they're going to be more resistant to disease, right? Well, this actually is not necessarily true for a few different reasons. So if we look at our heirloom varieties are very, very specifically grown. They can be limited to a region or even an individual family. And let's face it, I'm sure all of you have heard some story where someone will tell you about the tomatoes their grandma grew that stayed in the family for years and years. That's not really an unusual story here in Indiana. That's a fairly common practice. These lines, in order to be an heirloom variety, they had to have been preserved for 50 years or more. And I'm sure if someone actually did the anthropological or archaeological work behind it, you could probably discover that some of those tomato lines are well past 100 years in age, if not more. Now, here is the problem with some of these. When you create an heirloom variety, you are doing so for particular taste, texture, maybe some quality of how it grows. But this means that these plants are open pollinated and they're at risk for cross pollination, which can bust your line. Getting cross pollinated means that your trait lines are going to get skewed by whatever it's getting pollinated with. And also, when you're developing an heirloom variety, you aren't thinking about disease resistance. Many of these heirloom varieties are some of the most susceptible to disease, or they may reach early maturity, or they could have stunted growth because the quantitative trait loci that are associated with flavor and color and texture aren't necessarily associated with disease resistance and structural strength or health of the plant. Now, this is versus our hybrid varieties. Now, hybrid varieties are produced through very controlled pollination, and they are intended to be able to grow in very, very specific ways, very, very solidly with particular traits of the parents going into the offspring. These traits are almost always intended to make higher yields, to produce increased resistance to disease or pest pressure, or to be able to resist different unfavorable environmental conditions. Now, here's the bad thing. Hybrid varieties, you can't use the seeds from the tomatoes you grow. Since they are hybridized, most likely those seeds won't actually germinate, or if they germinate, they're going to do very, very poorly. Or they're going to have their traits mixed anyways because pollination would have occurred during the season. So the tomatoes you would get in the next generation aren't going to be the tomatoes you got in the first one. So you could see that hybrid versus heirloom tomatoes, there's a little bit of give and take in both. It's really about what you want. If you want to grow your heirlooms, that's great. Go for it. Heirloom tomatoes can taste great. But if you want to grow your hybrids, that's good. You're fighting disease. You're probably going to derive some more benefits. It's just the following year, you're going to have to buy some new seed or new transplant. So a little bit on some growing conditions that I want to talk about. Now, some of the folks who are either here this evening or will be watching the recording of this aren't in Indiana. So I want to make this clear that when I'm talking about tomatoes, I'm talking about the tomatoes grown in hardiness zone 6 and a little bit of 5. So your circumstances might be a little bit different if you're from outside of our state. Your season length may also be different. Now, the reasons I bring this up in terms of disease is because at either end of the growing season, we can expect higher moisture contents. Now, I know we just went through a drought, but if you have ever been in fall in Indiana, you know that sometimes it gets a little bit rainy. So that means that we're going to see increased moisture. And obviously, the spring in Indiana is swamp season. We are going to get a ton of water during that time. You're going to want to monitor the length of your season compared to what your hardiness zone says. So here in Indiana, we're going to experience, say, our first frost. I actually put that on here because I looked it up between October 12th and October 19th. So, growing, the season's going to end right around that week. We can expect to be able to get soil temperatures high enough to start planting sometime in May, maybe even April if it gets warm enough. So depending on the area you're in, you're going to want to have that information so you know when the best time to plant will be to reduce your risk of infection. If I want you guys to take home anything this evening, I want you to take home the idea that moisture especially too much moisture, is going to be bad. It's going to make the situation better for disease to begin to enter your tomatoes. So speaking along those lines, we're going to look at location and watering for just a moment too. So like I was saying, the moisture content and the general health of the plants are going to determine how easily they're going to get infected with things. If your tomatoes came out of your house where you were transplanting them and they look pale and leggy, they're probably going to have a harder time versus tomatoes that were transplants that were kind of stocky and well built. You're going to want to practice some good choices when you're choosing the ground to put them in and monitoring your own sanitation practices. And when I say sanitation, that means cleaning tools you use, cleaning gloves you use out in the gardening, making sure the soil you're using hasn't been infected with pathogens before you put the plants in the ground. Now, a lot of these choices are going to be based on your personal environment and the goals for your crops. One thing that I also want to keep in mind is that where you put these tomatoes is going to determine how much sun they get. So tomatoes require 8 to 10 hours of full sun a day. They do not do well with partial shade. They also need well-drained soil. Tomatoes do not like wet feet. You're going to want to place your tomatoes away from any trees and shrubs to, one, reduce competition for resources, and two, avoid any plants that may do any kind of localized suppression of plant growing, such as black walnut. So black walnuts like to put a chemical in the soil that inhibits the growth of any other plant near them. And we want to make sure our tomatoes aren't near something like black walnut or other plants that can produce any kind of chemical that does that. Now, in terms of watering, we need to keep in mind that tomatoes need approximately 1 inch of water per week. They don't need more than that. They are designed to be able to survive with 1 inch of water per week. If you overwater or if you poorly water, you are inviting disease into your plants. You can also invite in other issues too. For example, overwatering can often lead to skin cracking on the fruit because the water content in the fruit rises faster than the skin is able to grow to encompass that water volume. Underwatering also causes a different kind of problem. I'm going to show you some images of it in a little bit here, I believe, but if you want to avoid blossom end rot, you need to make sure that you do not underwater your plants. And I'm going to go, like I said, I'm going to go into that a little bit more in just a moment. So let's talk a little bit about seeding versus transplants. Now, you wouldn't think that much would come into play here when talking about disease, but this is actually a little bit important. So when we talk about seeding or just growing from seeds, this gives you a lot more variety choice. It gives you options to be able to look at plants that already have disease resistance built in, and you can save unused seeds for years as long as you store them properly. The bad part about this, though, is that seedlings have extremely high mortality rates. There's a reason why we usually start them in our homes. That way we could try to increase their chances of survival. Now, if we compare that to transplants, we're talking something that's going to be way more expensive by comparison. You're also limited to whatever transplants are available to you. A lot of us are going to get our tomatoes from herb sales and plant sales that are happening with master gardeners or other gardening clubs. And we need to look at what they're growing and what they have available. This also means that transplants are going to give you a faster time to harvest, though. So once you put a transplant in the ground, it's going, and you know that it's going to come up faster. One thing that I always focus on when it comes to transplants, though, is make sure that when you buy something that's going to be transplanted, do not bring in something that is already infected with disease or is already infested with some kind of insect or mite pest. You want the best start possible, so you want to choose the best plants. Don't make your life harder by choosing something that's already got a problem. Now, a little bit more on our transplant quality. I wanted to include this so we can just have this information here. So you want to choose small, stocky plants that do not have fruits or flowers, and I would say no buds either. That way, they're still in a vegetative state. They're going to do a ton of growing when they get in the ground and become stronger plants. You want those young plants to be focused on developing their foliage. That leaf tissue means that they're taking in more energy and they're going to be able to create more and more flowers and fruit. Make sure those transplants, though, are hardened properly by bringing them outside every day so that way they can get used to outdoor temperatures and the whatever environmental conditions you're working with. Don't just leave them in your home. Now, that being said, you're also going to want to make sure that when you put your transplants outside to harden, you do something to make sure that the local wildlife doesn't get into them too. So, for example, where I live, we have a lot of squirrels. And I guarantee you, if I put a transplant outside without protecting it, it probably won't be there when I get back. Now, if you are starting transplants yourself, if you are just starting them inside, here are a few things that you need to know. And this is a very common mistake I see. You need good artificial light. You need the light that's coming through your window, even if it is a south facing or west facing window, is not going to be sufficient for these plants. That window is going to filter out several components of that light, and it's going to dull it. The plants will not get enough. So you need something artificial to make up for the difference. You also need to be mindful of the pests that can develop inside your home. Now, in terms of disease, most of the ones inside your home aren't going to spread many diseases, but they will weaken the plant, making it more susceptible. They will wound it, which offers a pathogen entry into leaf tissue. Now, this means you're going to need to monitor for spider mites, whiteflies, and fungus gnats. And I have a few different programs on my YouTube channel you can look at that talks about those. And when we get to our program next week on plant watering, I'm going to be going into those quite a bit more. All right, so choosing some cultivars. Like I said, starting with the best choices is going to prevent a significant amount of disease for you. And what this is we are choosing cultivars for a couple of different reasons. The primary ones being, obviously, what kind of tomato do we want? Do we want a particular kind of taste, flavor? Do you want it for a particular color even, or amount of yield? And disease resistance. This is the one we should all look for. When you order your seeds, make sure you are ordering them from someone reputable. This is a common mistake I see. People don't know who they got their tomatoes from. They just got them and they thought they were great until they weren't. Make sure that you are sourcing them safely. For this, talk to your local extension educators, talk to your local master gardeners. We can help you figure out what is going to be worth your time. And keep in mind that not all cultivars of tomatoes are going to handle disease in the same way. There is no tomato that is perfectly disease resistant. I wish that weren't true, but that is simply not the case. Now, when you get your package of seeds that you ordered, here are some things that I want you to look for. They have disease codes on their surface that you can read that will tell you exactly what they are resistant to. And these different codes are going to be on the very front of it, and they should be fairly obvious too. These are the most common ones that you're going to find versus Verticillium, Fusarium, Alternaria, and a few viruses like tobacco mosaic and tomato spotted wilt virus. Some diseases do not have resistance yet. That is one that I'm sure a lot of tomato growers and scientists are working on. Now, if you want an idea what to look for, this is an image. I should also say that a lot of this presentation is taken from work done by Amy Thompson, who used to be the extension educator in Monroe County, and I want to make sure she gets credited for that. This is an image that was in her presentation for it, and it's a great one because it shows you the exact things you need to look for. So if we look at the image all the way on the left here, the celebrity hybrid tomato, it says it's determinate. So we know that it is going to be a bush type. And it is resistant to Verticillium, Fusarium race 1, nematodes, and tobacco mosaic virus. We can compare that to our next one, which is a big beef, and it is indeterminate, so it's going to be a vining type, and it's going to have resistance to Verticillium, Fusarium race 1, nematodes, and I forget what ASC is, the Stymphyla, and the tobacco mosaic virus. So I will have to look. I'm not sure if I included ASC in our disease codes. I'll have to look that one up and see what that one is. And again, I want to remind you about our heirloom tomatoes. Look at our Cherokee purple all the way over here on the end. This is called an heirloom, so that means it's indeterminate and it has no disease resistance built into it. These tomatoes were grown for their texture and their flavor, not for their disease resistance. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the different tomatoes you want to grow. All right, so now I'm going to just dive into some of these diseases, and I'm going to try to get through them a little bit quick because I know this one can be a little bit of a sleeper topic, but this way you can see what to look for as diseases occur and as they progress. So the first one actually isn't a disease. It is called blossom end rot, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this one. This one can occur in many kinds of plants, including tomatoes. I've seen them in squash, strawberries, peppers, all sorts of things, and tomatoes perhaps the most. What this is it is a symptom of a lack of calcium entering the plant tissues. Now, that actually, a lot of people will say that, but in reality, what it is most soil has enough calcium in it. What it means is you're not watering your tomatoes enough, and the water is used as the transport medium for the calcium into the plant. So what you can do is you can add mulch to preserve soil moisture. And then if your ground is particularly dry, just go ahead and water your tomatoes. And make sure you're doing your watering correctly, though. You want to water them at the base of the plant, water directly to the soil. Don't water over the leaves. Verticillium wilt. This is a fairly common disease of tomatoes. This is going to include yellowing of the lower leaves, and you're going to see little V-shaped lesions begin to appear on the leaf surfaces themselves. If you cut the stem of the plant, you're going to see a brown discoloration in the pith, so that very center area is going to have this funny brown discoloration. And what that is that it is a fungal infection, and it is traveling through the pith and through the vascular system of the plant, which is why it gets that discoloration. Unfortunately, verticillium and most of the other diseases I'm going to refer to here are going to have no curative controls. And I've seen Kathy is saying ASC stands for Alternaria stem canker. Thank you. I could not figure that one out. Thank you for telling us that. So another extremely common disease of tomatoes is Fusarium wilt. This is perhaps the most common. The wilt is typically going to happen on one side of the plant. Again, this is a fungal disease, and what's happening is it is blocking off the vascular system within one of the branches of the plant, which is why you begin to see the die off on one side. The leaves will begin curing or turning a bright yellow. Unlike verticillium, though, it is going to remain a fairly healthy color in the pith itself. So it's only blocking off certain points. It's not just wholesale creeping up the vascular system. So there are some nutrients still moving. Now, like you may have seen, there are different races to Fusarium. Ultimately, if you want those identified, the best thing to do is to send in samples of your tomatoes to something like the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab to properly get it identified. I probably wouldn't be able to identify that with the equipment I have on hand in my office. All right, so early blight or Alternaria. This is yet another very common one. And this one, to me, it's kind of the nightmare, because not only can it occur on tomatoes, it can occur in essentially just about every garden plant you can think of. I commonly talk about Alternaria when I do programs on squash or peppers or other plants. So it is definitely just a messy little disease that is kind of everywhere. But the good thing is that Alternaria is very easy to identify. So what's happening here is I've got a close-up of one of the lesions that can form with Alternaria. And what it is, this one's fairly large size. They'll start off as a small dark spot on the older lower leaves. And as the spots grow, you will see concentric rings within the lesion itself, just like you're seeing in that picture. So hopefully you could see the mouse pointer over this. There's a light yellow outline surrounding the lesion. And then you can see these concentric rings inside that lesion. Now, eventually what's going to happen is you're going to experience leaf loss, and spots will begin to appear on the fruit. So this one can go ahead and infect the fruit as well. That's not necessarily going to be true for all the diseases, though. Septoria blight is one that we've gotten hit by again and again. It doesn't always occur, but it is a fairly common one. Septoria blight does have spots like Alternaria does. However, we can identify it by the little tan centers that they'll have. They'll either be tan or gray. So you can see on the image, you can see again, there's that kind of yellow outline. It darkens in the lesion itself. And then inside, in the middle of it, there's that tan palish area right in the center. Now, what's going to happen here is this is the fungus reproducing. It's going to form this kind of pimple-like structure called a fruiting body, either on the underside, I believe on the underside of the leaf, that you should be able to see. And what this is, the spores of the fungus are going to come out of those structures. Now, the good thing is that this disease generally doesn't travel to the stems or the fruits, but it's going to kill a lot of leaf tissue. Later on in the season, on older plants, that may not be that bad because as you lose leaves, well, hopefully you've already gotten your bumper crop of tomatoes out of it. Earlier in the season, though, it can be a really big problem because that leaf loss means that you're losing your energy generating organs and you're not going to get as many fruits and they're not going to be as high quality. Bacterial spot is one that I honestly don't run into too often because this one's actually fairly easy to avoid. When we get bacterial spot, we look for small water-soaked spots that are going to be on the surfaces of the leaves. They may be on the stems, but most commonly on the leaves. And those spots are going to start kind of green to yellowish in color, eventually turning reddish. The spots may enlarge or they may kind of bubble up or sink inwards. Basically, it's pockets of bacteria that are forming in abscesses in the leaf tissue. So those spots will sink as the leaf tissue dies off and gets destroyed, and they'll have defined ridges on them. This will often lead to unusable fruit because it's been infected by a bacteria. The fruit will not survive, certainly not in a form that you want to eat. And unfortunately, it leads to plant death. And then for the disease that I'm going to go over this evening, there are a few of them, but I chose to go over tomato spotted wilt virus because I thought the image here was really fascinating. So the picture you're looking at was done by a gentleman named Whitney Crenshaw. He is from Colorado State University. He's a researcher there, and he has a lot of fascinating articles on insects and plants. And I just want to make sure he gets credit for this image too, because I love the work he does. When you get tomato spotted wilt virus, you're going to get plants that are going to be stunted and yellowed. You might see mottling on the leaves that could be light and dark green. And you're also going to see mottling on the fruit. I love this picture because it shows that mottling so very well. And I think that almost looks like somebody painted them. Unfortunately, this means that the fruits are going to ripen unevenly. They're going to have raised bumps, or they could have off-colored circles on them. Essentially, it's a fruit that you definitely are not going to want to eat. Now, I've gone through several diseases now, and of course, a lot of us are going to be asking, okay, we've sat here for a half hour. What can we do to actually try to avoid these diseases? This one is actually the simplest and the hardest thing in the world to do. The first thing is to make sure that our soil does not have a pathogen in it. Unfortunately, as our plants get infected, pathogens can remain in the soil for years. So we need to move our plants. We need to make sure that we don't plant there again for some time. Unfortunately, fungicidal applications may not necessarily resolve the infection, and it may not simply be worth your money to do so. It depends on how much fungicide you're willing to pay for to try to save tomato plants that will only be around for a single year. Like I said, fungicides may not really cure it. They may only do a little bit to help prevent. And then viral and bacterial infections have no treatments, and they can easily spread due to pest pressure. A lot of those viruses are actually transmitted through the activity of pests like aphids and other insects that have piercing, sucking mouthparts, or mites. What we can do is we can try our best to prevent it. Now, I mentioned what to do with soil. The other thing you can do is manage your pests. Like I said, those insects, they will transmit disease. Certain insect species are going to be very, very good at transmitting disease. Things with piercing, sucking mouthparts. Some of the beetle species, if you have like spotted cucumber beetle, can transmit disease. So we want to make sure we're managing them as effectively as we can. The other thing is mind your watering. I will say that again, mind your watering. Do not pour water over the leaves. Make sure you watch how much you are watering. Remember, tomatoes only need an inch of water per week. You need to make sure that you are controlling how much water you are putting on those plants. And like I mentioned earlier in our session, get your transplants from trusted sources. Make sure you're not bringing in something that already has a disease or a pest issue. And now, sometimes it's not possible to be aware of that when you get them. The minute you are aware of them, get it away from your other healthier plants. Get rid of the plant. You're not going to save it. It's going to have problems. Just go ahead and make the sacrifice so that way the rest of your plants are going to be able to do better. One of the other things that we can do is mind our sanitation as well. Pathogens, like I said, remain in the soil for years. I'm going to harp on that over and over. If you experience an infection, move your plantings to a different location the following year. Let the pathogens go out of the soil, hopefully over time. Unfortunately, some spores will remain in the soil for years. But if you just don't plant there the following year, you're going to increase your chances of being more successful in that area in the future. Clean your tools to reduce chances of transmission. You know, a light bleach mixture will get tools nice and clean, and they'll take care of pathogens on them. You can also make sure that you clean your gloves that you garden with too. And of course, like I was talking about earlier, use resistant varieties. Those, if you are experiencing pressure from a particular disease year after year, plant a variety that is resistant to that. If you do so, that means that you are reducing the incidence of that disease, and it will become less prevalent over time, even if a few of them get infected. All right, that is what I had in terms of slides for all of you this evening. I just want to make sure that I share my contact information with you. Here are the numbers for both my offices. I've also got a link to the Purdue Ed Store and the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. Please feel free to use either of those anytime. And with that, I'm going to thank you all for being here this evening.